Hello and welcome to the President's Class, now solely on YouTube for the pandemic and from home. It's a beautiful day in Los Angeles and the windows are open, so you may hear some things, but I'll try to edit them out. Thank you for joining us in this ongoing series, Seeking Wisdom in Troubled Times. I believe that truth has only one face, that of a violent contradiction. So wrote Georges Bataille in Violent Silence. In the previous two lectures, we looked at the power of stories as maps for living. We studied the general process of stories changing when the map no longer accounts for the territory, and explored a particular case study of a new story emerging. We also learned that new stories do not come from outside of culture, but are already here in forms that we do not yet recognize. Roland Barthes described them as existing in a halo of virtualities around our existing myths. So our new stories are waiting to be born, ready for us to call them forth, to steal their language, to craft a new myth, and to create a new reality. Even when we do this act of conjuring, it can take some time to enact them, or we can reject the process outright, usually at our peril. You may have noticed that in these two lectures, the topic of truth never really came up. There are good reasons for that, which we will explore in this lecture. So it is time to look at what is true and how we know it now in the pandemic. First of all, have you felt the anxiety around the notion of truth during the pandemic? I know I have, and I'm guessing that such a response is not limited to leaders of esoteric institutions and philosophy professors. Even if we do not recognize or mark it as an epistemological concern, we know that what we know has been shaken at best. How did the novel coronavirus come to exist? What are the symptoms of those infected? How is it transmitted? Who can infect others and how? Should I yell at maskless runners on the sidewalk, or is it okay? Those are the more quotidian questions, and we can and are getting some answers to those, though they seem to come painfully slow at times. Other questions run deeper. How do we develop a vaccine, and how quickly can we do it? What societal structures, or lack thereof, have made the pandemic worse? What structural changes can we make to prevent this from happening again? What will our future look like? Other questions run to the bizarre. Is this a plandemic designed to increase vaccination rates and make people sick by forcing them to wear masks? Is COVID-19 a government plan to take our guns? As we saw previously, when stories change, things can get weird. The biblical character Job had a truth that he devoted his life to. And as we saw last week, that truth was a massive rationalization, covering up the fact that the universe was created by a God who likes to gamble with human lives. His truth, what he knew at the beginning of the story, was left in dust and ashes. And his new truth, his new understanding that he was himself dust, emerged as a comfort to him at the end, albeit after some painful poetic lamentations. The truth is always changing. And when it does, great distress ensues. Power reconfigures itself, and ultimately a new kind of personal and cultural identity can emerge. It can be an identity of self-imprisonment, made of fragments of the old story. Or a genuine liberation can occur by stealing the language of the old and adding to it new ideas that make for a better map of the world. In such alchemy, a new identity, a new world, and a new truth can emerge. Pandemics and other catastrophes create tears in the fabric of consciousness. We sense this loss and we began reweaving our texts to patch the holes. Storytelling is always constructed over a loss, the literary critic J. Hillis Miller reminds us. And it is the way to recovery as well. Behind everything we think that is true lies a set of assumptions. Behind those assumptions lies a story that produced them. So what is true now, and how do we know? Let us begin with a hypothesis. Truth is a function of time and place and is validated by story. Loss and suffering create the need for new stories, and from that process emerge new truths. There is no better or more succinct account of this process than Franz Kafka's little parable about leopards in the temple. Leopards break into the temple and drink all the sacrificial vessels dry. It keeps happening. In the end, it can be calculated in advance and is incorporated into the ritual. There are many things I love about this profound parable, but the most basic insight is also the most challenging. Things change, even sacred things, and we lose nothing sacred when they do, or we need not. In fact, more than the rituals and symbols themselves, adapting to change is the sacred. How is this so? It has to do with the nature of life on earth and with how we use our symbols, whether they are leopards or words. It is understandable to want things to remain the same. It makes life much easier for us if we can keep the world still. If an object ceases to move, it can be held, analyzed, studied, all the while being non-threatening to the fragile human observer. Of course, living things that stop moving completely are dead, and while we can learn from them, the lessons are limited to those that come from such stasis. You can do a lot with this kind of analytical truth, and we certainly have. Truth is that which is unchanging, is the cornerstone of Western philosophy, science, and culture. As he often is, Plato is the marker, since he inaugurated a method by which to transcend the world of becoming, where everything is in flux, to enter the world of being, where everything is static. It is an attractive, if deeply flawed, aspiration, and we have built towers of ideas attempting to reach it, only to have our efforts thwarted by the ever-present world of becoming and the way we represent that world in language. While we remain the inheritors of that paradigm shift that Plato created, it is a story that has been dying a slow philosophical death since at least the 19th century. Like Job and his contract with God, Odysseus with the mast and keel of his ship, we keep hanging on to what's left, and it is not much. While it may seem odd to have a discussion of truth after 2 lectures on story, it actually makes sense to do so. Stories come first, not only historically, but also philosophically. The story of truth is a drama full of heroes and villains, plot twists, and technology. It begins before recorded history and takes us right to the present. The main characters are named Muthos and Logos, or in English, myth and truth. By myth, we mean the story behind the stories, the deep narratives that create maps for living. By truth, we mean not only what is the case, but also its related word logic and the systematized effort to find that which never changes nor is subject to the vicissitudes of life on earth. The word muthos itself could be pre-Greek and may be related to ma, mu, or other words referring to mother. Etymologically, it moved from that primal meaning to something like what comes from the mouth. That is, words or language, and by extension, story or myth. When we look back at this etymology, we're seeing it refracted through a prism of logos. But the world of Muthos was actually wildly different from ours, and thus difficult to imagine. The way to truth, thought itself, was different too. What is it like to live in Muthos without logos, story without truth? We can answer that question by thinking of a world that is not based in writing and the information it contains. In such a world, there are no devices that hold and convey information. That includes phones, computers, televisions, and the like, but it also includes typewriters, pens, and paper, and anything written down. Stop for a moment and imagine that world. It was one that was inhabited by our ancestors and one that still shapes our thinking. What would it be like to live with spoken words as our only method of communication? What would be true in such a world? In the world of Muthos, every communication was communal, which is to say that speakers had to be within earshot of listeners. Language was thoroughly human, unlike writing, which makes words separate from the speaker and turns them into objects. In this world, words are made of breath, not paper or pixels. And that means that words are events. They happen. As such, they create something new, ex nihilo, that is, out of nothing. This is no romantic notion, though it is awe-inspiring. Words indeed bring delight, but they can also cause death. They are instruments of power in the world of Muthos. The Hebrew word dabar, coming from a mythological culture, means both word, event, and theme. There are deep philosophical ramifications here, especially in relation to static and dynamic truths. As Walter Ong notes in his book, Orality and Literacy, it is not surprising that oral peoples commonly, and probably universally, consider words to have great power. Sound cannot be sounding without the use of power. A hunter can see a buffalo, smell, taste, and touch a buffalo when the buffalo is completely inert, even dead. But if he hears a buffalo, he had better watch out. Something is going on. In this sense, all sound, and especially oral utterance, which comes from inside living organisms, is dynamic. That there is a connection between the spoken word and action would be surprising only to those living in Logos. For those living in Muthos, words are the vehicle of creation itself, as we can see in Genesis. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. The act of creation through speech is what philosophers of language call a speech act. Saying it makes it happen. We still use speech acts here in Logos, such as, "We find the defendant not guilty," or "I now pronounce you husband and wife." And there is no special formula at work here. Rather, it is the nature of language and life, without writing and print. Furthermore, those living under Muthos see the entire world as animated, that is, as alive, because of their naming of these elements. Naming is a speech act, which is an exercise in power. Ong notes, Oral peoples commonly think of names as conveying power over things. Explanations of Adam's naming of the animals in Genesis 2:20 usually call condescending attention to this presumably quaint, archaic belief. Such a belief is in fact far less quaint than it seems to unreflective chirographic and typographic folk, writing and print folk. First of all, names do not give human beings power over what they name. Without learning a vast store of names, one is simply powerless to understand, for example, chemistry and to practice chemical engineering. And so with all other intellectual knowledge. Secondly, chirographic and typographic folk tend to think of names as labels, written or printed tags imaginatively affixed to an object named. Oral folk have no sense of a name as a tag, for they have no idea of a name as something that can be seen. Written or printed representations of words can be labels. Real spoken words cannot be. When European missionaries entered this world, they found it bizarre, even satanic, to look upon everything as having life. Later anthropologists would find the same phenomenon fascinating, but, quote, primitive. For our ancestors, it was simply true. Word, event, and thing were one phenomenon. It was what they believed. And like us, they believed what they believed to be true. Well, what is the nature of truth in such a world? Missionaries and anthropologists thought that our human kin were worshiping the devil or simply ignorant, which led them to miss much about this world. Their measure of truth was based in logos, that which is outside of human existence, permanent and absolute. Well, we will examine that concept shortly. What they missed was the truth of story, the story of how to live, which is the only truth that matters, ultimately, whether you live in Muthos or Logos. Their philosophy was the love of wisdom, concepts that help you survive in a world that is fragile and hostile, as well as shot through with breathtaking beauty and the sublime. In such a world, one needs to know things: where the water is on the way south, when the mountain lion hunts on the mesa, what the other tribe does when you violate one of their customs, or how to ask appropriately to join a feast. These are important truths, but thoroughly contextual with land, time, and culture, and language. Where are these truths stored? Since there are no communication devices or technologies, the only place these truths can exist is in the memory of a person and her people. And the container for those truths is story. There remains no better technology for the relaying of information than story. And we remember stories better than anything else. Data is interesting, but there is a story behind and in front of data. We mine data for meaning, but it comes from a story about what counts as important and goes to a story about what is true. Stories are better at containing truths because they are dynamic, not static. They adapt with change. We can make stories static and inflexible, but we have to go to great lengths to keep them propped up. Eventually, they become what my colleague Will Lynn calls zombie myths, stories that are circulating, walking around, but dead. The Bible is one such story. I do not say this lightly because I have a degree in biblical studies, but I also have a degree in biblical studies, so I can tell you truly that this story is not one story, but many. and it is the most referenced and least read text of Western mythology. We pick over its ruins, scavenging for small treasures or weapons. In finding a truth, we proclaim its source as the Bible, and therefore authoritative for all people, places, and times. Meanwhile, the story itself and the people who lived it are long gone. Stories in the Muthos, however, are alive. Like life, they are ephemeral, emerging in breath, existing in memory, and continued in further tellings until they are no longer useful. We do not hold them, they hold us, direct us, nurture us, and tell us who we are and what to do. Like us, they are filaments in a web that is both delicate and strong. In fact, their likeness to us is corporeal because words form the connective tissue between bodies. Something vibrates in my throat and produces vibration in your ear. Stories' rhythms are the cadences of our breathing and our heartbeat, and their shape is the form made by our mouths and tongues. Stories use these forms to generate formulas, mnemonic devices to keep the story in personal and cultural memory and to aid in their transmission to future generations. We can see these forms in the stories that have become written down, from the Greek epics to the Bible to the Mayan Popol Vuh. Though to us in the Logos, they can sound odd, boring, or childlike. For those in the Muthos, however, such forms and formulas convey the truths of the culture there and then. Walter Ong again notes, in an oral culture, to think through something in non-formulaic, non-pattern, non-mnemonic terms, even if it were possible, would be a waste of time. For such thought, once worked through, could never be recovered with any effectiveness as it could be with the aid of writing. It would not be abiding knowledge, but simply a passing thought, however complex. Heavy patterning and communal fixed formulas in oral cultures serve some of the purposes of writing in chirographic cultures, but in doing so, they of course determine the kind of thinking that can be done, the way experience is intellectually organized. In an oral culture, experience is intellectualized mnemonically through memory. Ong continues to articulate several features of oral-based thought. Among them are that oral-based thought is additive rather than subordinative. You find a lot of ands, but not parenthetical statements, hierarchical statements. They are aggregative rather than analytic. It's the sturdy oak in the wine-dark sea, so you put adjectives together with nouns rather than breaking them apart for analysis. They are redundant or copious. They repeat themselves because this is about keeping them in memory. They're conservative or traditionalist. You've got to hold on to what you remember in the literal meaning of the word conservative. They are close to the human life world, as we shall see, and agonistically toned. They are competitive. They are empathetic and participatory rather than objectively distanced. They are present-based, and finally, they are situational rather than abstract. This last feature is especially relevant to the story of truth. So let us spend a bit of time here. Truth in oral cultures is situational rather than abstract. Ong puts it this way. Oral cultures tend to use concepts in situational, operational frames of reference that are minimally abstract in the sense that they remain close to the living human life world. Let's take a moment and examine an instance of such Muthos meeting Logos. A.R. Luria's book, Cognitive Development, Its Cultural and Social Foundations, is the source of Ong's claims here. And the book is unique in that it is a study of a culture of myth encountering the forms of thought of truth or logic. His work shows that truth as logos is derived from the technology of writing. Luria did extensive fieldwork in oral cultures in Russia in 1931 and 32. But his book appeared in English only in 1976 and contains examples of trying to introduce the truth of logos to the people of Muthos. He showed his subjects, for example, geometric forms and asked them to identify them. Rather than calling them circles or squares, as we who think abstractly in logos are taught to do early on, the subjects called them objects with which they were familiar, such as plates or doors. Quote, subjects were presented with drawings of 4 objects, 3 belonging to one category and the 4th to another, and were asked to group together those that were similar or could be placed in one group or designated by one word. One series consisted of drawings of the objects hammer, saw, log, and hatchet. A 25-year-old illiterate peasant said, "They're all alike. The saw will saw the log and the hatchet will chop it into small pieces. If one of these has to go, I'd throw out the hatchet. It doesn't do as good a job as the saw." Unquote. The peasant had his own truth, one that was based in experience rather than abstraction. In fact, there is little, if any, philosophical abstraction in the culture of Muthos. What there is instead is a rich and expansive imagination that is grounded in experience. Closer to the truth as we know it, here in the West, is the syllogism. This is a 3-part argument with 2 premises and a conclusion. The first premise is general. All people are mortal. The second premise is specific. Socrates was a person. As you can see, the third part, the conclusion, is already there. It just needs to be stated. Socrates is mortal. Well, syllogisms can be highly theoretical and abstract. Like logic itself, we actually use them often in speech, especially advertising. For our purposes, however, they serve as the quintessential example of logic and logos, our way here in writing culture of reaching the truth. Note that the syllogism is nearly completely abstract. There's a person named Socrates, but otherwise there's no place or time involved, nothing concrete, and it doesn't even have to be Socrates. We're in the world here of being, not becoming, of mental abstraction rather than lived experience. Not surprisingly, it was in a syllogism that we see the first proof of God's existence. In his 1078 work, Proslogion, St. Anselm wrote, in a syllogism, 1. God is that being than which no greater being can be conceived. 2. It is greater to exist than not to exist. Can you see it coming? 3. Therefore God exists. If you feel a little tricked by this syllogism, you have a taste of what A.R. Luria's subjects felt when he attempted to introduce the logic of the logos to them. He presented them with some syllogisms. Precious metals do not rust. Gold is a precious metal. Does it rust or not? Typical responses to this query included, do precious metals rust or not? Does gold rust or not? 18-year-old man. Just questions. Precious metal rusts. Precious gold rusts. 34-year-old person. My favorite, in the far north, where there is snow, all bears are white. Novaya Zembla is in the far north, and there is always snow there. What color are the bears? Here's a typical response. I don't know, I've seen a black bear. I've never seen any others. Each locality has its own animals. This inability to think logos in Muthos bears out even when Luria asks his subjects to define themselves using questions that are common in the literate logos. What sort of person are you? What's your character like? What are your good qualities and shortcomings? How would you describe yourself? Response: I came here from Kurgan. I was very poor and now I'm married and have children. Are you satisfied with yourself, or would you like to be different? It would be good if I had a little more land and could sow some wheat. What are your shortcomings? Well, this year I sowed 1 pood of wheat and we're gradually fixing the shortcomings. In previous lectures, I have spoken of understanding ourselves in a way that does not place humanity at the center and apex of the universe. In the Muthos, such an idea would not only be strange, it would actually be impossible to arise at all, because of the nature of the tools being used to get to the truth that is in spoken language. As Ong notes, writing separates the knower from the known. Without writing, there is no separation. When asked if he is satisfied with himself, a member of the Muthos responds that it would be good to have a little more land to sow some wheat. That is because there is no self to speak of. There is only the fragile web of relation in which he is a small part. Or as Job puts it at the end of his ordeal, I am comforted that I am dust. Spoken language alone does not permit me to see myself as separate from anything else. Among the many lessons we can take away from Luria's experiments is that truth changes with the form in which it is expressed. For those living in Muthos, or oral cultures, truth is simply what is the case for now, at this moment, from my limited perspective. It is concrete and confined to the purview of the subject, or more importantly, her culture, because it is a shared truth. This truth is also necessarily protean. That is, it changes with changes in the concrete experience of the human beings espousing it. For example, in an oral culture, there is no history as we understand it in a literate culture, no objective chronicle of events written down for reference. Old memories and the stories that hold them disappear when they are no longer useful. Genealogies of kings can be edited to support or dethrone the current king as the need arises. Such a notion sounds strange and even dangerous to our literate ears, but we still have Muthos with us. It's just hidden beneath the veneer of logos. So the truth of Muthos lives in logos, but it is covered over by layers of logic, history, and philosophy. We see it in one of our foundational literate texts and can see the oral features embedded there, along with the dynamic truth it contains. Speaking of kings, the genealogy of the King of Kings is a good example. In the book of Matthew in the New Testament, the genealogy of Jesus is wrong. It is incorrect. That is not me being provocative. You can look it up yourself and compare it to the same source Matthew used. The writer left out 3 names. Here is that gospel's opening line: an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. After that, we get the familiar begats. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah, and begat, and begat, and begat. I do not want to get too much into the biblical weeds here, but there are a lot of interesting details about the story. My main point is that Matthew's genealogy is incorrect. Specifically, he omits 3, perhaps 4 names. And he is getting his information from a source in the Hebrew Bible. So how could he get this so wrong? The answer is that this genealogy is coming from an oral culture with its protean truths. We are looking at it from a literate perspective, and our fixed truth to call it wrong. The writer of the Gospel of Matthew had his source, but adapted it to the new reality, which is that Jesus is the son of David, just as we saw in his opening. David is a flawed but revered figure in Jewish history, and he is the ideal of what a king should be. To state that Jesus is the son of David is to say that he is a king like David, and that is saying a lot. In fact, saying so supports the idea that Jesus is the Messiah. In ancient Hebrew and Greek, numbers were made with letters in a process called gematria, so that in English, A would be 1, B would be 2, and so forth. The word David in Hebrew would be the numerical equivalent of 14. Not surprisingly then, and in complete harmony with his listeners and with the truth of Muthos, Matthew ends his genealogy with this line. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. Put another way, David plus David plus David equals Jesus. Jesus is the son of David and a king like him. That story is more important than a true genealogy, and none of his listeners would have missed his point. I've taken some pains with this example because, like the entire Bible, this passage exists at the intersection of Muthos and Logos, the truth of story and the truth of logic or history. These are 2 different truths, one fluid and dynamic, the other frozen and static. Both serve their roles in their own worlds. And while we live now with notions of truth generated by writing, we remain creatures of story and of those truths. We can see this story of truth in the etymology of the word itself. In Greek, the word truth is aletheia, not forget. Listening closely, you can hear the root word lethe, which you may remember if you have not drunk from the waters of the river of the same name. Lethe is the river of oblivion in the Greek underworld, or Hades. The dead drank from it to forget their earthly lives. Some sources have it existing in the liminal space between Hades and Elysium. So to be true was to not forget, aletheia. That notion comes right out of Muthos, where truth resided in memory and story rather than in external objects. In more recent languages, we get a similar but slightly different angle. In Old English, we have truth as faith, faithfulness, fidelity, loyalty, pledge, covenant. From the Germanic languages, we have having or characterized by good faith. And from a Proto-Indo-European root, to be firm, solid, steadfast. For most of our history, the use of the word truth has been about remembering and faithfulness, not an allegiance to a reality outside of us. It is about having good faith in your search for truth. Now, if we return to Plato, we see the same thing happening with Muthos and Logos as we do in the Bible. The oral culture of Homer was being supplanted by the literate culture of Socrates and Plato. While Plato loves and honors Homer, he proceeds to demolish the culture of truth that produced him. No poets are to be allowed in Plato's Republic, which is ruled by a philosopher king who spends his days contemplating the forms, eternal, unchanging truths existing in the world of being that necessarily exists somewhere outside of this world. Though their words sound nice and poetry is pleasant enough, the poets belong to the world of becoming and imitation, and thus cannot know the truth, that is, imitation of the forms. The only one who contemplates the unchanging forms, especially that of truth, is fit to rule, and those who are unable or unwilling to become philosophers must be subject to the guardians, the philosophers' army. In the story of truth, the climax may have occurred in the 4th century of the Common Era. As we saw in the Gospel of Matthew, the New Testament was born in Muthos. Even in its written form, the oral features of its provenance remain. In the letters of Paul, which comprise the majority of the New Testament, and are, of course, written, there is little sense of logos and more a sense of pastoral care for specific churches facing particular problems. In fact, Paul specifically notes in certain letters that his words are his own and not from God. From the beginning, Christianity was a story of a marginalized and oppressed people struggling to survive in the Roman world that had no place for them. The stories they told and the letters that they wrote were dynamic and responded to serious situations on the ground. Running parallel to the story of the New Testament is the story of Plato's heirs, who continued his work on the forms as Neoplatonists. In the 4th century CE, these two stories merge. Actually, to be fair, it was not a merging, but more of a larceny. A Roman general named Constantine proclaimed Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and what it needed to decide then was what that religion was officially. The story had to be fixed into Platonic truth, or at least, Platonic truth. Newly empowered Christians chose to submit their story to this truth, the one with power associated with it. Logos consumed mythos. The story of the Gospels was left behind in favor of texts and doctrines that would come from the church councils formed to decide them. From that point, the mysterious, unpredictable, challenging, and even dangerous Jesus of Nazareth became the tamed Christ of faith, born not of a virgin, but of a committee. Martin Scorsese gets this exactly right in his The Last Temptation of Christ, where he has Paul meet the uncrucified Jesus face to face and say to him, I'm glad I've met you because now I can forget all about you. The church councils did the same thing, opting to transform the dynamic life of Christ and his followers into a list of theological statements and canonical texts. In this far too quick summary of such profound events, we must also include science in the story of truth. Around the 17th century, thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, Francis Bacon, and René Descartes began to search for truth using methods that were outside theology and based on what they called natural philosophy, or what we would call science. Actually, science uses a method that is unique and has been a viable story for all of us. Now in the pandemic, most of us are looking to virologists, immunologists, and epidemiologists to save us. And we have no doubt they will, as they usually do, with testing and ultimately a vaccine. True to the name, scientists take the unknown and make it known. The scientific method, as it has been called, is a story, like all stories, that has produced gods and monsters, from robots that supersede us to bombs that can destroy the planet many times over. In terms of truth, however, science is more mythological than logical. To be more precise, science uses a kind of logic to make the unknown known, but it never assumes that it has the final answer. The method itself will not allow that kind of truth, and that is the genius of science. It constantly corrects itself by remaining an open inquiry, not a closed one, where foundational truths can be overturned with new truths. Physics, for example, has two now incompatible truths, Newton's and Einstein's, and it will live with that until they can be coordinated in some new truth. The scientific method uses hypothesis and testing to come to its conclusions, but the number of hypotheses and test conditions are too numerous to validate. As Robert Pirsig notes in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, for every fact, there is an infinity of hypotheses. Furthermore, even our scientific perspectives are limited. Pirsig again notes, we take a handful of sand from the endless landscape of awareness around us and call that handful of sand the world. The beauty and genius of science is that it will not validate a story that it cannot prove, and every story is subject to invalidation by the method itself. Please understand, I am not discounting science. On the contrary, I believe science is perhaps the greatest story we have ever told for our immediate needs. But science is not designed to get us to Plato's truth, and it never will. The first and perhaps greatest scientist was Plato's student Aristotle, and he recognized that any universals must be instantiated. That is, there is no truth outside of things themselves. Raphael depicts this disagreement well in his painting, The School of Athens, where he has Plato pointing up to the forms and Aristotle pointing down to the things of the world. In a previous lecture, I referenced an experiment from Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, but I did not mention his primary thesis, which is that science advances via paradigms, models for the world that are constructed rather than given. Advances in science, he argues, come from errors that cannot be accounted for in the existing paradigm, which ultimately can cause a revolution and a new paradigm. Kuhn writes, unanticipated novelty, the new discovery, can emerge only to the extent that his anticipations about nature and his, the scientist's, instruments prove wrong. If it sounds as if Kuhn is arguing that science proceeds like stories, that is because he is. Quote, if these out-of-date beliefs are to be called myths, then myths can be produced by the same sorts of methods and held for the same sorts of reasons that now lead to scientific knowledge, unquote. That Kuhn has to make this point at all reveals how we are so easily seduced by the siren song of Logos. Why would our greatest human creation, science, not be able to produce a final and absolute truth? It is the same reason that any other story cannot produce an absolute truth. The world is unknowable to that degree. Here is Thomas Kuhn once again. Observation and experience can and must drastically restrict the range of admissible scientific belief, else there would be no science. But they cannot alone determine a particular body of such belief. An apparently arbitrary element, compounded of personal and historical accident, is always a formative ingredient of the beliefs espoused by a given scientific community at a given time. That sounds very much like Muthos to me. We tell a story to help us navigate a world that is difficult at best, and that story must constantly adapt to a changing world and its own limited perspective of it. We cling to our story and sometimes assume that it has mapped the territory. But the territory is too vast and too dynamic for any one map to represent it. So we must remake our maps with every intrusion of the unknown or the unaccounted for. Our supreme good must lie in adapting ourselves to a world that remains unknown to us. And our efforts to find truth are that adaptation. The worst mistake we can make is to think that we have found a story, a truth that is fixed and final. We are too small, and the universe is too big for that kind of story, as Job learned. Further, the world will destroy our stories, like the whirlwind in Job, as a reminder that we too are part of the world, not outside or above it. So here we are in the pandemic, and our stories are changing, new ones are being born, and truth hangs in the balance. My offering to you, from one seeker to another, is that this has always been so. Whether it is a story in the Muthos and is thus localized and relational, or a story in the Logos that aspires to break the constraints of the local and relational, our stories never quite match up to the world. The map never quite fits the territory. This is a gift. It keeps us moving, it keeps us alive, and it keeps us human. Can you imagine a perfectly true story? What would it mean to be human in a world where we knew the immutable truth of everything? Where change did not occur, or where change did not register in our truth? Where our stories never need to change, and our map is the perfect representation of the territory. Plato imagined a truth that belonged to such a world, but he had to place it elsewhere because he lived in the world of becoming, our world. We remember that Plato's republic is not a democracy. Rather, it is a timocracy, a system based on honor or worth. And most of us are not worthy in Plato's eyes. We are the prisoners in a cave who see only shadows. The world of becoming, of change, fraught and limited as it is also a free world, which the world of being can never be. Shifting stories, modified maps, uncertain truths, these make for a world of anxiety, uncertainty, and fear, but also a world of magic, hope, and freedom. As Karl Kroeber notes, wherever real storytelling takes place, an essential human freedom exists. What is true now, and how do we know? What is always true at any point in time, the stories we tell and how well they help us navigate a strange and wonderful world. How do we know these stories are true? They are true when they work and untrue when they do not. Unfortunately, we have ways of telling these things. If your story finds you consistently at odds with the world, it is probably time for a change. For example, if you do not believe in viruses or their power to make you and others sick, you are out of sync with the world. The story of what a virus is and how it works, while still mysterious in some ways, is a good story because it's one that works. The more people who remain uninfected, the better the world is. It's that simple. In my first lecture, I mentioned an experiment reported by Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where subjects were shown anomalous cards, such as a red six of spades. Most of the subjects never saw the red six of spades. Instead, they saw a black six of spades with a red border. Or they lost all sense of suits and numbers and cards. they became very angry and frustrated. If you are perpetually angry and frustrated, you have a myth that is failing you and a new one waiting to be born. Our deepest emotions tell us whether our stories are true or not. I do not mean our superficial emotions that are reactions to immediate events. I mean the French and German emotions, ennui and angst, those deep-seated dissatisfactions that cause despair and prompt us to go on a journey sometimes. Here again, we see remarkable benevolence in the universe, or at the very least, an amazing human adaptation that tells us when we are in or out of sync with the world outside of our words. It would be disrespectful to the gods to not recognize such a gift by trying to hold on to only one story and calling it the truth. Or to put it much more succinctly and profoundly, leopards break into the temple and drink all the sacrificial vessels dry. It keeps happening. In the end, it can be calculated in advance and is incorporated into the ritual. Thank you for your attention.